Everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today, I found a pretty eye-catching headline that reads, Ancient Feces Reveal Parasites in 8,000-Year-Old Village of Çatalhöyük. This is probably like my fifth video about this place, Catalhoyuk. And if you don't know, let me pull up the map here. Yeah, so here's a pretty decent map of Turkey and Anatolia. And you can see right here, Çatalhöyük is about south of center of Turkey, and I've done a bunch of videos on this region mainly because Göbekli Tepe is in this area as well. Göbekli Tepe is further east. It's in the southeast part of Turkey, so it's not that far from this settlement, which is one of the oldest settlements known to man. Dates back, I think the official dates date it back to about 7100 BC, so well over 8,000 years ago. And just for reference, Göbekli Tepe dates back even further, a few thousand years further than that. So the theory goes, or one of the theories go, that Göbekli Tepe was the center of learning for stuff like agriculture and civilizations and these foundational subjects, I guess, that help build the foundation of human society as we know it today. And so Çatalhöyük is one of these. It was almost like a mega city, one of the first ones, because it was very densely populated. And you'll see in this article why, or the after effects of that, rather. The journal Antiquity, which is a pretty prestigious journal that, along the lines of Nature, they publish a bunch of different articles and such. Ancient feces from the prehistoric village of Çatalhöyük have provided the earliest archaeological evidence for intestinal parasite infection. So intestinal parasite infection, we're talking about this. This is a whipworm. So in order for this to even come about within humans, there are a few things have to be going on. One, people have to be living pretty close to each other, because the only way people can get this is if the feces, which are pooped out and are either on the soil or something, comes into contact with some sort of water source or a food source or something. So it's a sanitary issue. And sanitary issues only really come up when you have a dense population living close together. So let me show you this picture. It's an artistic interpretation of what it must have looked like at the time. And if this is true, then yeah, you can see that people were living in really close quarters here 8,000 or so years ago. So it does make a little bit of sense that something like a whipworm or other parasite would flourish in an environment like that. Okay, so now that we know what we're dealing with, let's continue. So people first gave up hunting and gathering and turned to farming in the Near East. That's the other thing too. Farming and the agricultural lifestyle where you stay in one spot. That is also because of farming. And again, this is supposed to be the birthplace of farming here. Where is it? Yeah, this is supposed to be the birthplace of agriculture and pretty much all society. Just an aside, I watched this video and I read up a little bit about who the Trojans really were. Troy was also in this location, but it was further west. It was along the western part of Anatolia, and they. Researchers were either dumbfounded or they just didn't know who the Trojans really were. And then the article was mainly about their R1b haplogroup. It's unique to them, apparently, and how they spread into Greece and how they split off into 3 different types of people. It's pretty interesting. I'm not going to go to it at length here. Anyway, my point is that those people, they say that they come from the center of all where humans originated, which is Turkey, and even a little bit further east, like around Göbekli Tepe, around modern day Armenia, south of the Caucasus Mountains, around there. So anyway, that just adds to the mystique of the whole area. And also it's really old. It's 8,000 plus years old, maybe even further. And I'll get into that in a second. So Çatalhöyük is famous for being an incredibly well-preserved early village found around 7100 BC. So this date, obviously, people dispute it. People think it's a lot older. people think it might be 1,000 years younger. There are different, whenever you have dates like this that push the boundaries, people try to dispute it or criticize it, which is fine. I think it might be older than this because what they found, the feces that they found, dates to about this time. So someone was there to poop it out, and they already had the worms. So I don't know how long they were really around, unless they were the very first people around. Anyway, the population were early farmers growing crops such as wheat and barley, herding sheep and goats. This change in lifestyle resulted in a similar change in the types of diseases that affected them. Absolutely. Because animals are attracted to different things. So when you have, especially if you don't have like a sewage system and you don't have a trash system like we do now, they just leave it in a designated area called midden piles, and these midden piles can get huge. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys, if you've ever been to your local landfill, things get out of hand pretty quickly if there isn't any city infrastructure to take care of that. So they had these midden piles piled up all the way, and that attracts vermin, all kinds of insects. You know, God forbid it gets hot. It's just a huge cesspool of bacteria and stuff. And you combine that with a densely populated city, you can get stuff like whipworms, which has terrible side effects. Like it lowers IQ, people die, stunts their growth, people die early, and all that stuff. Anyway, so the article makes mention of a toilet which was first invented in the 4th millennium BC in Mesopotamia, so 3,000 years later than when Çatalhöyük flourished, allegedly. So they're assuming that they didn't have any toilet system or anything like that, which would make sense. So let's go back to this hypothesis that I was talking about. So if, let's say 9,000 or so BC, Göbekli Tepe starts churning out all these different students of agriculture and laws, like the code of laws and all that stuff, and then they branch out. Think about the troubleshooting they would have had. They probably would have had trouble with logistical stuff like this. So if that's true, then yeah, not having a toilet is an issue that they had to address. And maybe they did address it. Maybe there were some type of proto toilet back then that they haven't found yet. And it's interesting that in Mesopotamia, which is not that far away, they invented the toilet allegedly. So yeah, maybe the person who invented it in Mesopotamia actually got wind of it from someone in Turkey. Either way, it's a very logical thing to think that they would, like a sewage issue or a trash issue would have been one of the first things that these newly educated agriculturalists would have run into. It's thought the people living at Çatalhöyük either went to the rubbish tip to open their bowels, so they either went to these the trash dump to take a shit, or they carried their feces from the house in a bucket to dispose of them, or a basket, whatever it was. And if that's the case, if they were doing the do at home and then carrying it back to the midden pile, yeah, they probably would have gotten on their hands. They probably didn't know about bacteria or like washing hands, so that's probably the most logical way that it would have spread, because that's the only way these whipworms, these demonic like beings, that's how they get in, is through a water source or a food source. This would have put the population at risk of diseases spread by contact with human feces, and explains why they were vulnerable to contracting whipworm. As writing was only invented 3,000 years after this time, the people were unable to record what happened to them during their lives. This research enables us for the first time to imagine the symptoms felt by some of the prehistoric people living who were infected by this parasite. So this is really interesting because a few months ago, or not even a few months ago, a few weeks ago, I did a few videos in South America, and some of those people died, like 90% of them died in one go from like smallpox and other types of illnesses that they weren't exposed to ever. So this made me think, if it's true that the people of Turkey from thousands of years ago, they ended up populating because their haplogroup exists in places in the northern part of the Mediterranean, like in Italy and Greece and such. Maybe perhaps they got all that stuff, that bacteria, those illnesses. The ancestors developed an immunity or something, and then thousands of years later down the road, they ended up going to the New World and spreading it to those people who weren't exposed. I don't know if that's true or not, but that makes sense to me. Maybe something like that happened. This is just what I was thinking as I was reading this. So let's get into the nitty gritty. So to look for the eggs of the intestinal parasites, the Cambridge researchers used microscopy to study preserved pieces of human feces, which are the scientific name coprolites, from a rubbish tip, and soil formed from decomposed feces recovered from the pelvic region of burials. So they took poop from the corpses themselves, and the samples dated 7100 to 6150 BC. So again, if these dates are true, then yeah, these people were there to die with this in their system at the time when Çatalhöyük happened to be established. I don't know, that seems like a hard sell. It just seems to me that Çatalhöyük probably was already there, and then they died, so who knows how long before that it was there. So I think it's probably a little bit older than 7100 BC at the very least. So the next thing they did is they wanted to make sure that it was human or animal feces, and so they analyzed them for sterols and bile acids, and then this analysis demonstrated that the coprolites were definitely of human origin. I don't know the details of that. I don't know what makes it human origin as opposed to animal, but it has to do with, I guess, the amount of sterols and bile acids that are in there. Probably there's like a human signature or something like that, if I had to guess. So further analysis showed that the eggs of whipworm were present in 2 of the coprolites, demonstrating that people from the prehistoric village were infected by this intestinal parasite. And this is pretty gruesome. They're about 3 to 5 centimeters. They live on the lining of the intestines of the large bowel, and then the adult worms can live up to 5 years. And so, yeah, if you get whipworm back then, you're stuck with it. And it's spread by the contamination of food or drink from human feces that contain the worm eggs. And a heavy infection leads to anemia, diarrhea, stunted growth, and reduced intelligence in children. So the next step that they want to do is finding fecal matter from prehistoric hunter-gatherers in the same area, and to see how that contrasts with the fecal matter from the people who were living in cities or settlements. Yeah, I'm not sure about this, guys. That's pretty disgusting, but it makes a lot of sense though, and I think it adds more evidence that people, not only were people living here, but they had pretty substantial settlements, and apparently a lot more people were on board with agriculture, more than we thought, because you have a big enough population for a lot of people, for corpses to have whipworms that would survive to this day, the evidence of would survive to this day. And that to me means, like, for anything to survive to this day for us to study, that alone is very rare. So the fact that that exists must have meant that there was a substantial amount of people living in one place. So if there was a substantial amount of people living in one place, then the story of hunter-gatherers slowly, like we get this picture of them slowly turning into agriculturalists, that transition must have either A, happened a long time ago, or it wasn't a slow transition at all. It might have been just a huge refugee group from another place that had their homeland destroyed, or they got displaced somehow, and they had this knowledge, and then they settled in places like Egypt and Turkey, and they just started anew there with whatever knowledge they had left. And to me that makes a lot of sense, because how would they build a town like this if it wasn't if they didn't have any real well thought out plans? Because with architecture especially, when you see it like this, and I know this is an artistic rendition, but this is based on some of the archaeological finds that they have, and so they've just used their imagination to fill in the gaps. But yeah, it could be something like this. And if it looks something like this, then there must have been some sort of order, some sort of stability that everyone got on board. Everyone in that area got on board. And so in order to unify people like that, there had to have been some sort of sophisticated either language or understanding that people were going to live in this community and they were going to contribute and they were going to survive off the land and try to be as prosperous as they could. Now, they had whipworms and they didn't have everything figured out yet, but how much do you expect them to have figured out if they are indeed a displaced people? Anyway, let me know what you guys think about this. I thought it was fascinating. How does this figure into settlements of Asia Minor, of the genesis of civilization itself? If you guys know anything about the Trojans or the R1b haplogroup, I'm all ears about that as well. And I'll talk to you guys later.